Hey folks, so I'm breaking up this series on the Stanford Binet scales into tiny chunks so that I can record them in between any kind of outages. Yeah. And so I think there are going to be a lot of little tiny chunks. I'm trying to break them up thematically, so we're going to talk in this little chunk about kind of the modern Stanford Binet, or not the modern, the like precursor to the like Binet scales, just to get you some sense of um what's going on. Cool. Okay, so there's a pretty long history with the Binet scales. Um, they were kind of initiated in 1905 at the behest of kind of the equivalent to the Department of Education, and they were kind of built upon by both Goddard around like 1910 and onward, and some various kind of like adaptations of it eventually made their way over to Lewis Terman and Otis, whose first name I'm blanking on right now. They had a test out by 1911 that was pretty closely linked with the original. By 1916, Terman had developed the Stanford Binet 1, which focused on just one main construct and a couple of scales. It's been modified a couple of times. Stanford Binet 2, 1937. I'm not going to go through all of these. In the book, they talk about the 1986 version, so the 4th edition. There are some changes, and I'm going to talk about those in a bit. But yeah, so the Stanford Binet 2 is 1937. Stanford Binet 3 is 1960 through 73. After Terman passes, right around then, it gets taken over and heavily adapted and revamped. And so we're going to start next time on Stanford Binet 4, which is what the book covers. But I'm going to keep going just so that you guys have some content. So Binet started with a unitary G model, so like one measure of intelligence. It had 30 items, and it was age-based. So they had 3 levels of intellectual deficiency of what they tried to classify people as. So, and these are the terms they used. So, idiot, well, the French version of it. Idiot, so that was the most severe impairment. Imbecile, which was moderate impairment, and moron, which was only mild impairment. And so apparently there is a rank order to intelligence-based insults. And so moron is the smartest of the 3, then imbecile, then idiot. These were legitimate classifications for mental ability, cognitive ability for quite some time. There's this thing called the euphemism treadmill that kind of forces us to adapt. Because even terms used in the book are no longer politically correct because they've been repurposed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's some problems with the scale. So it's only 30 items. It's unclear what the unit of measurement is. So it's just 3 levels. Like how much difference is there between imbecile and moron versus imbecile and idiot? Are they? I mean, there's definitely an ordinal level here, but is it interval? So are they equally spaced? Are they absolutely spaced? Does a idiot, do 2 idiots make an imbecile? Again, these are kind of the quant side of these, like how do you do math with these numbers? And you can't. They also used a really small sample of 50 kids. Yeah, and so in general, there's pretty limited validity, but this is 1905. So given the technology they had and the knowledge they had, 50 wasn't so bad. We would never publish a scale today with this small of a sample just because it's unclear how well of a reference group this is. Also, like, does it have predictive validity, discriminant validity, you name it? There's lots of questions and lots of issues, but it's a great start. So by 1908, they make the age scale kind of continuous. And they introduced this term called mental age, which we have covered already. So it's this idea that you can describe the level at which an individual could reach on that 1908 scale. And if you could perform specific tasks like answer questions that could be performed by 2/3 to 3/4 of the average 10-year-olds, then you had a mental age of 10. So if you could do what the 2/3 of what the typical 10-year-old could do, 2/3 to 3/4, it's subjective, like how quantified as mastery or not, but that was the idea. So it still has problems. It's still just a single score, and it's really heavily verbal. And actually, the term and study of geniuses, which will end up using an adaptation of this test to identify geniuses, missed a couple Nobel Prize winners because the tests were so verbally oriented and kind of missed out on the quantitative and spatial reasoning. So having a test that's really skewed for one kind of content domain or like one kind of facet of intelligence has some downsides. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the 1916 version comes to the United States via Lewis Terman of Stanford. They increased the sample size of their study, so all the kids were white and native Californians, but it was still better than 50. They retained this idea of age differentiation by using an age scale, and they retained the notion of mental age. I have a copy of one in my office. Fortunately, I cannot share it with you because it's in my office, but it's pretty cool looking. But here, oops, sorry. So so what they did was they combined mental age and chronological age into the intelligence quotient, which we should be a little familiar with now. But the idea is that whatever your mental age is divided by your chronological age, and that ratio times 100 is your IQ. So if you're 10 years old and you're performing at the ability level of a 12-year-old, you have an IQ of 120. We're going to stick with 10 just because the math is easier. But that same kid, if you perform at the mental age of a 9-year-old, you only have an IQ of 90. Now, if you kind of play around with this, you can see that you need larger gains the further along you go in order to maintain the same IQ. So at age 5, to have an IQ of 120, you only need to perform a year above. But at age 10, you need to perform 2 years above. And at age 20, you would need to perform 4 years above. Yeah. So it's not nicely it doesn't have a nice kind of 1-to-1 ratio. And so because you have to gain more performance. You have to learn at a faster rate in order to maintain your IQ under this system, which had some problems, which we've already kind of talked about. So there were also some other problems. Test topped out at a mental age of 19 and a half. So everyone older than that would produce some kind of mental deficit. So if you if you're 20 years old and you performed with you topped out, that puts you at a 19 and a half. If you are 40 and you topped out, that still puts you at 19 and a half. So you eventually end up with even with perfect performance, you have an IQ of 50 by the time you're 40. So yeah. Now, typically any mental age above 16 would be set to 16. There was this belief at the time that mental age maxed out at 16. So at 16, you were at your peak. You could get no more. You could not get any smarter. You could not perform any better. And so, yeah, there. I don't know about you, but I've learned a lot since I was 16. But um, yeah, so some of this was theory driven. Some of it was just eventually they had to stop making the test. They had to stop because, whew, you can't like that nonlinear growth really builds up and makes it a pain. So the 1937 edition, so that's version 2, had a much larger standardization sample. It had 11 states in it, so it had more urban subjects than rural. Only whites were included in the standardization sample, which unfortunately was very common in 1937 because, well, it was 1937. Yeah. Okay, so they had 2 alternative forms, so the L and M form. There are still problems with this, so there were different standard deviations at each age for the standardization sample. So like standard deviation age 6 was only 12.5, while at age 12 it was 20. And this meant that IQs at different ages weren't comparable. You couldn't compare across because they shifted away from the from that like IQ ratio eventually. But when you're norming it, so instead an IQ, so one standard deviation above the mean would mean you had a score of 120 at age 12, but only a score of 112 and a half at age 6. So you couldn't really compare the scores, which is a pain. So the 1960 version, they smushed all the forms together because there weren't really any differences between like the long and the medium form. So they just smushed them and introduced this concept of deviation IQ. So I lied. They had the ratio in the 37 version, but not in the 60s, where they had the mean of 100 and 16 was the standard deviation. The other tests have standard deviations of like 15, which is a pain, because that means that an IQ of 130 is less than 2 standard deviations above the mean in the Stanford Binet, but I believe that it's exactly 2 standard deviations above the mean for the Wechsler. But the idea is that you're looking at how well above and below the mean a kid performs at a given age band. So the 1960 norms were better. They're still all white. They finally, in 1972, included non-white subjects in their sample. Just because, honestly, it's so frustrating when like people are just excluded from reference groups just because nobody thinks of it. Like, women were like not used in data for a very long time because nobody thought that there were any differences. Anyway, that's enough about me bitching and moaning. So I'm gonna cut this here. Oh, so I gotta run. Bye.